The sun had not yet risen over the towering walls of Chang'an, the bustling capital of the Tang Dynasty, and already the world was beginning to stir. The streets were still veiled in a thin film of night mist, punctuated only by the distant clop of a horse's hooves and the occasional crack of a merchant's whip as carts of fresh produce rolled in from the countryside. Inside a narrow alleyway just east of the city's vast East Market, a modest tea house with lacquered red columns and carved wooden eaves stood silently, its doors shut, its windows shuttered. But within, the day had already begun. You are walking in the shoes of Li Wei, a 54-year-old tea house host who has managed this establishment for over 3 decades. Li Wei's hair is graying, tied into a thin topknot, and his robes are practical, worn hemp, slightly tea-stained, and smelling faintly of jasmine and old steam. By this early hour, just a little past Sisher, or 9 a.m. by today's clocks, he has already swept the tiled floors twice, folded the sitting mats neatly by the low wooden tables, and carefully arranged a selection of clay cups on each surface. His fingers know their positions by heart. He moves not with urgency but with the steady rhythm of a man who has repeated these motions tens of thousands of times. In the back kitchen, a simple brick stove is heating up, and a ceramic kettle rests atop it, already humming as heat creeps through its belly. There is no flame yet, only warm embers from last night, revived gently with a small hand fan. Fuel is precious. Charcoal, not firewood, is the fuel of choice here, a luxury for some, but necessary for achieving the slow, even burn that brewing the finer teas demands. Li Wei starts his day not with tea, ironically, but with water. Several large clay jars stand in the corner, each filled with river water hauled in the night before. This water is poured carefully into a sieve of bamboo charcoal, sand, and silk mesh to remove sediment and odor. A good host knows, water makes the tea, not the leaves. While the kettle simmers, Li Wei inspects his morning teas. He offers 3 varieties each day. Longjing, Dragon Well, a crisp green tea for scholars. Pu'er, an earthy fermented tea for merchants and travelers. And a delicate white tea from Fujian, rarely requested but admired when it is. He removes the tea tins from their cloth wrappings, lifts their lids gently, and inhales with deliberate slowness. The scent must tell him everything: freshness, storage quality, even the mood the tea may invoke. He adjusts the order of the teas displayed for the morning crowd based on these silent conversations with the leaves. By late morning, Chang'an's arteries begin to pulse. The nearby markets open, the clang of bronze coins rings in the distance, and already the smell of grilled meat, fried dough, and fermented bean paste begins to seep through the wooden shutters. Li Wei opens the front doors slowly. The outside air flows in, rich with city scent, mixing with the earthy comfort of the tea house. 2 copper bells jingle above the lintel, not for decoration, but to ward off negative spirits, as his mother insisted. Before the first guests arrive, he performs his daily altar ritual. In one corner of the tea house sits a modest shrine to Lu Yu, the revered sage of tea, whose 8th-century book, the Classic of Tea, has become a sacred manual to every tea practitioner. Li Wei bows 3 times, lights a stick of sandalwood incense, and whispers a prayer, not for wealth, but for clarity of mind and serenity of customers. Soon, the first regular appears, Old Master Qian, a retired scribe who arrives with the same scroll every morning. He prefers to sit by the open window, where the breeze nudges the parchment as he reads it, even though he has memorized its lines years ago. Li Wei prepares him a cup of longjing, placing it on a tray of red lacquer, the surface inlaid with a simple cherry blossom motif. A pair of traveling monks, heads shaved smooth, who request pu'er without saying a word. A silk merchant's daughter, escorted by a maid, here only to gossip and admire the serving boys. A tax clerk from the Bureau of Salt and Iron, slumped in fatigue, who drinks strong white tea to wake his eyes. Li Wei does not ask questions. He listens, more than he speaks, and silently refills cups with water just before the final sip. It is not just good service, it is performance. And everyone watching knows it. The tea house itself is part of the rhythm of Chang'an's invisible life. It is not the loud public square or the imperial court, it is the quiet place between errands and decisions, between merchant meetings and street performances. You can hear the city's pulse through its walls. The wooden clatter of wheelbarrows full of bricks. The drumbeat marking official announcements. The cry of a street poet reciting his newest verses in exchange for coins or leftovers. And above all of this, in this corner of the East Market, a kettle hisses gently, the sound as constant as breath. You may wonder, how could something as mundane as pouring tea be so central to an empire's rhythm? The Tang Dynasty was one of history's most cosmopolitan ages. With traders, scholars, and travelers from across the Silk Road, tea houses like Li Wei's served not only drink but discourse, an informal court of the people. New ideas flowed here as freely as hot water. A merchant from Samarkand might sit beside a Confucian scholar. A Korean envoy might rest his legs beside a Buddhist nun from Dunhuan. And in the middle of it all, Li Wei would pour without judgment, offering tea as both refreshment and quiet invitation. But it wasn't always this way. Decades ago, when Li Wei first inherited this tea house from his father, Chang'an was recovering from rebellion. Streets were emptier. Trust was scarcer. Tea was still seen by some as an eccentric indulgence rather than a daily ritual, for the surreal peace of it all. It was an interlude, a garden between storms. A time when fountains spoke louder than cannons. And perhaps that is what makes it so compelling, that in the middle of an empire built on conquest, one man tried to rule with calm, quiet beauty. But peace is rarely permanent. And tulips, for all their elegance, are delicate things. You wake now to a softer sound, of feet on polished stone, of whispers moving like wind through silks. It is no longer the peaceful lull of fountains you hear, but the subtle hush of unease. The gardens of the tulip era are still in bloom, but something has shifted. Beneath the lantern-lit eaves and delicate trellises, dissatisfaction is growing. The empire still smells of rosewater, but something in the air is turning. The year is now 1729. On the surface, Ahmed III's Istanbul remained beautiful. Foreign ambassadors sent word back to Europe describing feasts amid flowerbeds and poetry contests held under paper lanterns. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, had opened more printing presses, technological novelties in an empire slow to accept them, and he commissioned public fountains with calligraphic inscriptions praising serenity and imperial grace. From a distance, it looked like a golden age. But golden ages rarely announce their end with cannon fire or coup. Often, they begin to crack from within, quietly. And that is exactly what was happening in the alleyways, workshops, and tea houses of Ottoman society. The ordinary people of Istanbul, the artisans, grocers, soldiers, and clerks, were not so enamored with tulips. Or rather, they were not enamored with what tulips represented, extravagance, privilege, and the aloofness of the elite. While Ahmed and his courtiers marveled at petal symmetry, many Istanbulites were navigating a sharp rise in the cost of living. Food prices soared. Housing grew more expensive. The rich were buying tulips, the poor were buying less bread. This disconnect was felt most sharply in the working-class neighborhoods near Edirne and Fatih, where public works promised during the tulip era often never reached. Meanwhile, grand canal-fed gardens were built for the nobility just across the Golden Horn. Ahmed's regime had unintentionally drawn a line, one that separated the empire not by geography, but by aesthetics. Those within the court lived in refinement and sensory delight. Those outside it endured noise, grime, and labor. And then came the preachers. In times of discontent, religious leaders have often been the first to channel unrest. In the late 1720s, mosques in the city's older quarters began to echo with fiery sermons, not against tulips themselves, but against what they had come to symbolize: frivolity, westernization, neglect of Islamic tradition. Leading the spiritual charge was a man named Patrona Halil. Once a low-ranking janissary and bathhouse worker of Albanian origin, Halil had lived the hardship of the common man. He had no garden, no silks, no access to festivals or flower markets. He did, however, have resentment, and the ability to stir others. He spoke of justice, of piety, of the old ways. His words found an audience in the disillusioned. Because what had once felt like peace now felt like betrayal. In 1729, a minor spark ignited a series of protests. A printing press, seen by some as a Western corruption, was attacked. Artisans whose trades had suffered under the court's imported luxuries began to gather, quietly at first, then more boldly. The janissaries, once the pride of the Ottoman military, had grown increasingly independent, and many were unhappy with the court's cultural detour from its traditional martial roots. And all the while, Sultan Ahmed and Ibrahim Pasha remained publicly unmoved. They held another tulip festival. They continued building pavilions. They smiled beneath carved wooden arches and arranged tulips on porcelain plates. But it was clear by now, the bloom was beginning to wilt. Within the Topkapi Palace, unease was also growing. Not all members of the royal family agreed with Ahmed's passive and floral style of rule. Some princes and viziers worried that the tulip era made the empire look weak. Others simply feared what might happen if unrest crossed the palace gates. Ahmed III, however, remained loyal to his vision, and to Ibrahim Pasha. The two shared not only a political bond but a deep personal friendship. Ibrahim had married into the royal family, giving him almost unchecked power in cultural and administrative affairs. While many respected his intellect, others saw him as the true ruler behind the throne, a dangerous perception in any monarchy. Whispers of a coming purge began to circulate. The palace trembled with things unspoken that in the spring of 1730, something broke. Patrona Halil, fed by months of preaching, resentment, and organized unrest, led a rebellion, small at first, but astonishingly effective. Armed with janissaries and local tradesmen, he marched toward the palace, calling for justice and reform. The uprising, known now as the Patrona Halil Rebellion, quickly gained momentum. The city's elite, unprepared for such direct action, faltered. Gardens were trampled. Pavilions were looted. Printing presses, symbols of elite detachment, were smashed. For the first time in years, the calm spell of the tulip era shattered like glass underfoot. In the spring of 1730, something broke. Patrona Halil, fed by months of preaching, resentment, and organized unrest, led a rebellion, small at first, but astonishingly effective. Armed with janissaries and local tradesmen, he marched toward the palace, calling for justice and reform. The uprising, known now as the Patrona Halil Rebellion, quickly gained momentum. The city's elite, unprepared for such direct action, faltered. Gardens were trampled. Pavilions were looted. Printing presses, symbols of elite detachment, were smashed. For the first time in years, the calm spell of the tulip era shattered like glass underfoot. Despite the violence and collapse, something of the tulip era remained. Perhaps it was the lasting presence of the Sadabad gardens, or the surviving artwork from the time, etched with the tall thin tulips that so obsessed the court. Or maybe it was something subtler, a realization that not all empire building had to be done with force. There is something hauntingly gentle about Ahmed's rule. His failure was not in cruelty or conquest, but in beauty misplaced, in gardens planted while the city cried for grain. History often favors the dramatic, the generals, the battles, the treaties. But Ahmed III reminds us that sometimes, the quietest mistakes are the ones that cost the most. And yet, would you say he was wrong to try? To turn an empire into a garden? To trade war drums for water fountains? You wake now in the silence after a storm. The flowers are no longer blooming. Their petals lie crushed into the damp soil beneath hurried footsteps. Gone are the night festivals, the perfumed lantern-lit evenings, the delicate calligraphy etched into public fountains. What remains? Scattered pottery. Burnt silk. Garden walls pulled down by common hands. It is late 1730, and the tulip era is over. But history rarely ends when the story does. What happened to Sultan Ahmed III after his abdication? What became of his tulips, his courtiers, his gardens? Did anything from that soft, strange time truly endure? This is the story of what lingers, long after the last petal has fallen. Unlike many deposed monarchs throughout history, Ahmed III was not executed, imprisoned in chains, or banished to a far-off land. Instead, he was quietly moved to the more secluded quarters of the Topkapi Palace, where he lived under a form of luxurious house arrest. He was no longer sultan, no longer His Imperial Majesty, shadow of God on earth, but he was still a member of the dynasty. He lived out his final years surrounded by a drastically reduced harem, a small cadre of loyal eunuchs, and most curiously of all, his personal tulip collection. It is said that he continued tending to them in small pots near his rooms. Even after losing his empire, Ahmed could not let go of his flowers. Meanwhile, Mahmud I, Ahmed's nephew and successor, took swift action to erase the extravagance of the tulip era from public memory. The Sadabad pavilion was stripped of many of its ornate fixtures. Printing presses were heavily restricted. Court fashion became subdued once more. Long flowing robes were replaced with more conservative cuts, and floral embroidery all but vanished. The message was clear: the age of indulgence was over. It was time to be Ottoman again, stoic, martial, devout. Yet even as policies shifted, the memory of the tulip era could not be completely uprooted. Bureaucrats trained under Ibrahim Pasha remained in office. Scholars who benefited from new access to books did not suddenly forget their learning. Architecture commissioned during the tulip era, especially its waterworks and libraries, continued to serve the people. In trying to erase a flower, Mahmud found himself pruning a vine that had already grown deep roots. Historians looking back now argue that, while brief, the tulip era introduced innovations that subtly changed the course of Ottoman society. Printing, while repressed again after the rebellion, had already taken hold. Books became more accessible, and literacy rates among the elite slowly increased. Architecture during this period marked a shift from purely Islamic design to one subtly influenced by European Baroque, a trend that would accelerate in later centuries. The urban beautification projects, while criticized at the time, left Istanbul with hundreds of fountains, some still functioning today. And perhaps most curiously, the idea that an Ottoman sultan could rule by culture rather than conquest, though ridiculed in Ahmed's time, would return in future generations. Sultan Mahmud II, ruling nearly a century later, would implement far more sweeping reforms, using many of the same tools: print, Western aesthetics, and public works. But unlike Ahmed, Mahmud II had the political cunning, and force, to sustain the transformation. So, was Ahmed III simply ahead of his time? Or was he just too delicate for the job? Long after the rebellion, tulips continued to carry cultural weight in the Ottoman imagination. No longer merely flowers, they became symbols, of beauty, of nostalgia, of fragility. In Islamic calligraphy, the tulip, layl, shares the same letters as Allah in Arabic script, leading many to believe the flower held a spiritual dimension. Artists, even in more austere periods, continued to paint tulips in miniatures and ceramics, not as luxury symbols, but as sacred, melancholic emblems of a lost ideal. Even modern Turkey honors this legacy. Every spring, Istanbul's Tulip Festival sees millions of bulbs planted across the city, from Emirgan Park to the Blue Mosque Gardens. The festival commemorates not the excess of the tulip era, but its gentler aspirations, to create a life of beauty, poetry, and peace, even if only for a moment. Ahmed's ghost walks among those tulips. Not as a failed sultan, but as a dreamer who tried to rewrite history with color. Among the long list of Ottoman sultans, warriors, reformers, tyrants, Ahmed III stands apart. He ruled not during war, but in a rare, strange pocket of peace. He built libraries instead of armories. He threw garden parties instead of parades. And yes, in doing so, he alienated many. He underestimated the anger beneath the surface, the needs of his people, and the weight of tradition. But his failure was, in its way, noble. He dared to believe an empire could be sustained on softness. In a world where empires rose and fell on blood, he planted flowers. Imagine him now. An old man in faded silks, bent over a narrow flower pot on a shaded palace balcony. The city beyond him no longer sings his name. The Janissaries no longer salute. His voice is seldom heard outside these walls. But here, in the quiet, he coaxes a last tulip to bloom. He strokes the soil gently. He watches the petals unfurl. He does not speak. He does not need to. Because for all the wars that forged the Ottoman Empire, it is this moment, small. He does not speak. He does not need to. Because for all the wars that forged the Ottoman Empire, it is this moment, small, still, and forgotten, that speaks more truthfully to the complexity of history. A moment of gentleness. You stirred gently into wakefulness, not to the sound of war drums or market chatter, but to the quiet scratch of a reed pen on parchment. Somewhere nearby, a candle flickers low, casting uneven shadows on a paper-strewn desk. The year is 1722, and you are deep inside the imperial scribal offices of Topkapi Palace, the heart of the Ottoman court's bureaucracy. Outside, tulips bloom and palace musicians practice soft tunes. But in here, behind the latticed windows and echoing stone corridors, the empire is not ruled with swords or flowers. It is ruled with ink. The Ottoman Empire was vast. At its height, it stretched across 3 continents and included countless languages, religions, and customs. And yet, for over 600 years, it held together, through invasions, rebellions, and dynastic disputes. How? Not by constant conquest, but by paperwork. Though the Sultan held supreme authority, it was the scribes, clerks, and record keepers who ensured that taxes were collected, decrees issued, land measured, and populations counted. Their work was never heroic or poetic, but it was essential. Their names were not chanted in battle hymns or immortalized in poetry. But every palace renovation, military campaign, and trade agreement passed through their hands. In the early 18th century, especially during the Tulip era, the Ottoman bureaucracy reached new heights of complexity. And yet, it remained cloaked in mystery, even to many Ottomans. So who were these men of paper? To be a scribe, a member of the Kalami, or scribal institution, was to live a life of quiet precision. These men were selected from childhood, often from the sons of lower-ranking officials, merchants, or artisans. Entry into the Kalami was competitive and required years of education, learning Ottoman Turkish, a complex mixture of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, calligraphy, arithmetic, legal codes, and the etiquette of court protocol. Once accepted, a novice scribe began at the bottom, copying routine. To be a scribe, a member of the Kalamai, or scribal institution, was to live a life of quiet precision. These men were selected from childhood, often from the sons of lower-ranking officials, merchants, or artisans. Entry into the Kalamai was competitive and required years of education, learning Ottoman Turkish, a complex mixture of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, calligraphy, arithmetic, legal codes, and the etiquette of court protocol. Once accepted, a novice scribe began at the bottom, copying routine correspondence, recording tax receipts, updating land registers. Promotions came slowly, and always based on accuracy, discretion, and endurance. One error, especially in the copying of a firman, imperial edict, could have consequences that stretched across provinces. A miswritten numeral could cause a village to be overtaxed. A misplaced phrase might insult a foreign ambassador. Their work had to be perfect. And it had to be invisible. Topkapi Palace was not a single grand hall, but a series of courtyards, chambers, gardens, and offices. Nestled within its northern section was the Imperial Council Complex, which housed not only the divan, council chamber, but also the archives, treasury offices, and rooms for senior scribes. Each room had its scent, leather bindings, dried ink, sandalwood boxes, and lamp oil. Scrolls were stacked in cedar cabinets. Account ledgers sat wrapped in linen to preserve them from humidity. Each morning, the head scribes would bow to one another, unroll the day's correspondence, and begin their silent work. Communication was heavily formalized. A junior clerk could not speak directly to the Grand Vizier unless summoned. Even speaking too loudly in a records room could be considered disrespectful. Instead, they passed notes, gestures, and, when needed, discreet whispering behind folding screens. It was a world of controlled silence. And for many, it was also a world of unrecognized ambition. Though scribes had no weapons, their pens wielded power. The most senior officials in the Kalamai, such as the Rais-ul-Kutub, chief of the scribes, effectively managed foreign affairs. Others maintained vast land registries, oversaw tax audits, and issued orders in the Sultan's name. A clever scribe could slow down a rival's request. A discreet one could protect a governor accused of corruption by altering a phrase or delaying a seal. In some cases, scribes even leaked information, anonymously, through coded reports to factions inside the harem or janissary ranks. It was dangerous work, though not in the way most people imagine. Death was rare, but exile, demotion, or disgrace could come suddenly, without warning or recourse. Careers were lost because a shipment of paper failed to arrive on time or because an official seal cracked in the summer heat. And so, they became obsessive. The best scribes double-checked every mark. They slept beside their ledgers. Some were rumored to carry backup copies hidden in their robes, just in case. They lived for the details. Consider, for a moment, the life of Mustafa Effendi, a mid-ranking land register clerk in 1723. He arrived at the palace before dawn, slipping through a side gate reserved for officials of his rank. His inkpot was carved from horn. His pen was reed, shaved to an exact angle. His robes were clean but plain, no brocade, no tassels, nothing that might hint at vanity. His task that week, reviewing Timar grants, land given to cavalrymen in exchange for military service. The grants had to be re-verified every few years. Villages were growing, populations shifting. If a mistake was made, an entire family might lose their livelihood, or a soldier might claim land he had no right to. Mustafa's work was lonely. He had no apprentices. His meals were eaten alone. He spoke mostly in formalities. His letters, when not written for the state, were full of apologies, poetic metaphors, and cautious greetings. The angle of the sun makes it harder to see the red guidelines on the paper. Xiao Rong adjusts his position, moves the oil lamp slightly, and keeps going. His back burns. His brush hand is numb. His knees ache beneath the cushion. He pauses briefly, not to rest, but to look. There is something in this silence that cannot be explained. The scratch of brush, the rhythm of breath, the smell of old paper, it becomes a kind of music. A song of those who will never be known. Not generals. Not poets. A hidden favor. Not ministers. A bending of the bureaucracy, just hands. That is supposed to hold the just minds together. Trained to preserve. He dips his Xiao Rong blinks, and writes anyway. And then resumes. The ink dries quickly. As the bell for day's end rings, scribes like place completed scrolls into marked wooden trays. Senior clerks will review them overnight. Any errors will be returned with a red silk tag. Rejected pages are burned at the courtyard altar, not for secrecy, but for respect. A bad scroll is still sacred, still a vessel. Xiao Rong gently places his scroll into the tray. No celebration. No sigh. He wraps his tools. Rinses his inkstone. Folds his cushion. He bows once to the room before stepping outside. Evening has come. The streets are busier now, vendors calling out skewers and sesame cakes, music echoing from pleasure houses, lanterns bobbing in merchant alleys. But Xiao Rong walks past it all, unnoticed. He returns to his modest room above a bookbinder's shop. He lights a lamp, eats boiled rice, stretches his legs, and sits before a small scroll of poetry, a personal one. Not for work, just to read. The characters shimmer in the lamplight. His eyes follow each one as though greeting old friends. He smiles. Tomorrow, the ink will flow again. Tomorrow, the memory of an empire will rest once more in quiet hands. Of the Ottoman administrative system was its paradox. It was both deeply centralized and quietly decentralized. While the Sultan and his viziers technically held ultimate authority, day-to-day decisions were often made by minor officials acting in ways shaped more by custom, regional relationships, or personal deals than by written law. In the provinces, for instance, the outcome of a land dispute might depend less on the actual documentation, and more on whether the local scribe owed a favor to the claimant's uncle. In Istanbul, this dynamic took on even subtler forms. Some clerks maintained shadow networks, unofficial contacts in the courts, the treasury, and even the harem. Messages were passed in book margins. Tiny ink dots placed above certain letters served as invisible codes to signal urgency or risk. If you knew the right signs, you could read an entire secret sentence embedded in a tax report. It was a game of influence, and those who mastered it rose faster than those who clung only to integrity. One of the few recorded incidents that hinted at this hidden world occurred in 1728, when a minor treasury clerk, Hassan Shalebi, was caught embezzling copper coin shipments intended for payment of provincial soldiers. The theft was minor by modern standards, a few crates, perhaps. But it triggered a quiet investigation by palace auditors. What they discovered shocked even senior viziers, not just one thief, but an informal network of price skimmers, shipment manipulators, and false ledger keepers stretching from Istanbul to Aleppo. No one was executed. Instead, reassignments began. Some clerks were invited to retire. Others were given meaningless posts far from the capital. Only Hassan Shalebi faced public censure, and even he was later rumored to be employed quietly as a tax advisor in Bursa. The empire had no appetite for scandal. Only for continuity. Senior scribes, by the time they reached the upper tiers of the Calamai, often possessed a frightening amount of knowledge. They knew which governors underreported census numbers. They knew which janissary payrolls were inflated. They could trace the real story behind an edict, just by the phrasing. Some of them recorded these patterns, not officially, but in private journals, passed down like secret grimoires. These journals never entered public archives. They were destroyed at death, hidden in walls, or burned by cautious sons. But every now and then, a page survives, a note tucked into an old register, or a marginalia scrawled between columns of numbers. A sigh between lines. A warning left in silence for all the corruption and compromise. Many scribes remained loyal to the empire. They saw themselves as part of something larger, a tradition of order, stretching back to the earliest days of the Devletaya Lai, the sublime state. They might fudge a tax date or delay a shipment, but they still believed in the mission, to preserve unity, to keep the gears turning. And yet, that loyalty came with bitterness. To give your life to a machine that no longer cared if you existed. To be vital, but invisible. To hold the empire's secrets, but never be honored with its praise. That was the burden they carried. It was not glamorous. It was not heroic. But it was essential. What happens when the quiet workers grow tired? When the ink-stained hands that built the empire begin to tremble? When order, so carefully copied, recorded, and archived, starts to decay from the inside out? The quill rests now. The ink has dried. The candles are out. And yet, the paper remains. Stacks upon stacks, lining silent rooms in forgotten corners of Istanbul. Documents sealed and folded, faded and brittle, still bearing the fingerprints of men who have long since vanished from memory. Names like Mehmed Effendi, Ali bin Yusuf, Fatma Hanim's grandson, the clerk, recorded in handwriting no longer taught. You are now standing, not among the living, but in the afterlife of bureaucracy. It is the mid-18th century, several decades after the tulip era has ended, but its quiet servants have left traces behind, woven into the fiber of empire. And what they built, unnoticed in its time, endures far longer than tulips. When we think of history, we often imagine great battles, bold decrees, or fiery speeches. But for every moment of glory, there are 10,000 recorded receipts. One decree becomes a file. That file becomes part of a register. That register gets duplicated in a summary log. That summary becomes a yearly report. And each stage, written by a different hand, adds a layer of interpretation. Ottoman scribes did not merely record history. They constructed it. Because what was written became what was remembered. And what wasn't recorded, no matter how noble or brave, was lost. In this way, the scribes of the Ottoman Empire held an invisible power, not to decide what happened, but to decide what lasted. By the 1750s, the imperial archives of Istanbul had grown into a formidable labyrinth. Official orders from Egypt, Bosnia, Tunis, and Baghdad arrived weekly, rolled tightly and wrapped in colored silk bands to indicate urgency. Some were opened the same day, others were logged and shelved, perhaps never read. The Ba Muharrir, chief writer, supervised a small team of elite archivists. Their job was not to interpret or comment, only to file and preserve. And yet, even their quiet decisions, how to group papers, which items deserved special folders, what to transcribe into summary ledgers, shaped the long-term view of imperial history. Modern historians owe much to these unknown clerks. It is because of them that we know how many horses were assigned to a provincial governor in 1719, or how much silk passed through Aleppo in 1725, or how much a baker paid in fines for shortchanging soldiers in 1731. The empire is gone. But its filing system remains. For all the detail, the archives are curiously silent on one thing: the scribes themselves. Their handwriting covers thousands of pages, but rarely does one leave a personal note. A few dared scribble a line of poetry on the back of a tax form. Some signed their names with flourishes that hinted at pride. But their feelings, their anxieties, joys, fatigue, ambition, are almost completely absent. They made themselves vanish. On purpose. This was the ideal of the Ottoman bureaucrat: efficient, invisible, loyal. But was this sustainable? Could a class of humans, trained to record everything, really survive while recording nothing of themselves? Even in a system as careful as the Ottoman bureaucracy, bias and fear distorted the record. A provincial scribe might exaggerate the loyalty of a local militia. A tax collector might underreport grain totals to protect a friendly landowner. Entire revolts might be mentioned only in euphemism, local unrest resolved amicably. The records had to please superiors. And so, they began to reflect not the messy reality of empire, but its desired image: stable, ordered, efficient. And yet, between the lines, the cracks show. An unusually high number of missing registers from a single year. A string of oddly phrased letters with no follow-up. A page where every line ends with the same polite blessing, copied like a spell to ward off attention. These moments don't scream. They whisper. As the 18th century waned, the Ottoman Empire faced increasing challenges: Russian encroachments, European commercial pressure, internal revolts, and the creeping realization that the empire's once great machinery had begun to rust. And yet the bureaucracy grew. More departments. More titles. More scribes. This was, in part, the system trying to correct itself, adding more rules to handle the chaos, more layers to cushion the blows. But like a tree adding rings in a drought year, the growth was more about survival than strength. In this dense thicket of forms and protocols, the spirit of the early scribes, the quiet pride in precision, the almost monastic devotion to balance and order, began to fade. The work continued. But the meaning behind it began to blur. Centuries later, as the Ottoman Empire finally dissolved after World War I, the fate of its documents became a quiet political drama. Tens of thousands of registers, letters, and tax scrolls were created, moved, hidden, or lost in the transition to the Republic of Turkey. Some were destroyed in fires. Others were stolen. A few were rediscovered in the 1980s, stacked in wooden trunks in old mosques or village schools. And yet, much was preserved. Today, deep inside the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, researchers still sit under fluorescent lights, flipping through parchment written by long-dead scribes. Some come to study politics or war. Others, food prices or flood records. But all of them, whether they realize it or not, are listening to voices that never spoke, only wrote. The scribes are gone. But their handwriting remains. The tulips of the tulip era withered quickly. But the bureaucracy outlived everything: the gardens, the viziers, the rebellions, even the sultans. Its legacy is not beautiful or dramatic. It's stubborn, detailed, and silent. It reminds us that empires are not only built by heroes, but by men who carried out the same task every day for 50 years, without applause, without ambition, without leaving their names behind. They believed in structure. In repetition. In order for its own sake. And though we may never know their favorite poems, their thoughts on love or fear, their favorite coffee flavor, we know they were there. Because the paper still bears the marks of their hands. What does it mean to dedicate your life to preserving something you can never claim as your own? And is that devotion, quiet, thankless, unseen, not its own kind of power? You arrive in a city at peace, not just politically, but emotionally. This is Istanbul in the early 18th century, sometime around 1718. The wars with Persia have ended, the border with Austria has stabilized, and the empire breathes a rare sigh of relief. The cannons are quiet, the janissaries are still, and something strange is happening. People are planting flowers. Not out of duty. Not in military camps. Not for religious rituals. But for beauty. For joy. For something that feels private. This is the beginning of what we now call the tulip era, a soft, fleeting moment in Ottoman history, when the empire's elite turned away from swords and scrolls, and toward gardens, poetry, lantern festivals, and, above all, tulips. It was an age where a flower became a symbol of empire, diplomacy was performed over tea in shadowed courtyards, and the shape of a petal could decide the fate of a merchant's fortune. But it didn't begin as policy. It began in secret. The heart of this transformation lies with Sultan Ahmed III, a ruler whose tastes ran more to delicate ceramics than to battlefield maps. Unlike his more martial ancestors, Ahmed had little desire to conquer new territories. He was a man of curiosity, obsessed with books, foreign novelties, and most of all, the intricate design of Ottoman tulips, a flower unlike any other in the world, with pointed petals and a silhouette resembling Arabic calligraphy. It began, as many things do, in a garden. In the back courtyards of Topkapi Palace, Ahmed commissioned his gardeners to cultivate rare varieties of tulips. Not just the red or yellow ones common in Anatolia, but hybrids, burnt orange, smoky lilac, velvet black. Soon, this hobby became an obsession. The Sultan issued edicts on bulb trading, demanded tulip-themed poetry competitions, and insisted that state couriers deliver particularly exquisite bulbs from distant provinces. But it wasn't just about flowers. It was about a way of seeing the world. As the sun began to slip behind the tiled roofs of Chang'an, painting the capital's western walls in burnt orange, a man named Yuliang stood at the East Market Gate, leaning quietly against a worn stone post. He held a tall wooden pole, not for defense, but to hang the nightly signal lantern. He was not a soldier. He was not an officer. He was a gatekeeper. One of nearly 60 men employed to monitor the dozens of large and small gates that punctuated the great capital's perimeter, each one like a slow-beating heart in the empire's body. His job was simple on paper. Open the gate at dawn. Close it at dusk. Report anything unusual. Stay awake. That last part, stay awake, was more of a test than a rule. Because when the world sleeps, staying alert becomes an art form. Yuliang had practiced this art for nearly 2 decades. Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, was a city built on rhythm. In the morning, bells rang from the bell tower to signal the opening of gates. In the evening, the drum tower announced closure. This created a cycle that was more than routine, it was law. No one could enter or leave the city at night. Gates were sealed. Streets were cleared. Lanterns were doused. Anyone caught wandering after curfew was detained, or at the very least, questioned harshly. And Yuliang, stationed at gate number 16 on the eastern wall, was one of the men entrusted with enforcing this curfew, more with presence than punishment. But it wasn't always so orderly. Yuliang had joined the gatekeeping corps during the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, back when street crime was rising and the military was distracted by border conflicts. He was younger then, stronger, louder, and prone to impatience. At the time, his only tool was a wooden staff and a set of polished copper keys. The gates were mechanical marvels, with iron bolts and heavy counterweights that required 2 men to operate. He used to think that strength mattered most. This subtle power, the aesthetics of peace, became a quiet weapon. But not all was well. Outside the walls of these perfumed gardens, life for the common people of Istanbul grew harder. Food prices were rising. Soldiers went unpaid. The janissaries grumbled. And many resented the sight of the wealthy wasting fortunes on flowers while grain was being rationed. Caricatures began to appear, tiny drawings hidden in markets, mocking the tulip obsession. One popular etching showed a flower bed sprouting coins instead of petals, while hungry children begged nearby. And yet, the elite doubled down. It was as if they believed beauty could insulate them from collapse. In a way, the tulip era was not just a time of peace. It was a delicate rebellion against the ugliness of reality, an attempt to preserve serenity in a world that refused to stay calm. But how long can such a fragile bloom survive? What happens when the wind changes? You are standing beneath a silk banner, hand-stitched with tulip patterns and strung across a marble archway. It is spring in Istanbul, 1727. The gardens are in full bloom. Courtyards overflow with fountains, lanterns, and the perfume of thousands of tulips. The Sultan's court continues its soft theater of peace. Music, tea, poetry, and parties. But if you look closely, you'll see something curious. Guards now stand closer to the gates. More whispering in the streets. More wagging fingers in mosques. The empire's tranquil surface is beginning to fracture. The tulip era, once serene and dreamy, is now so gilded that it has begun to crack under the weight of its own extravagance. And soon, it will all catch fire. At the height of tulip mania in Istanbul, certain rare bulbs were fetching up to 500 gold coins per piece, more than the average artisan would earn in a decade. The demand for tulips created a strange parallel economy among the elite. Land was converted into tulip nurseries. Entire farms were bought up and stripped to make way for floral experiments. Taverns turned into tulip salons. Young nobles competed over whose garden had the most unusual bloom. Some even held secret auctions in the dead of night, exchanging bulbs under flickering lanterns, as if trading diamonds. And it wasn't just tulips. The whole court was swept up in the obsession with refinement. New printing presses, imported from Europe and adapted for Ottoman script, began producing lavish books, most of them devoted to poetry, gardening, and philosophy. French perfumes were imported in casks. Paintings, previously frowned upon in religious circles, gained quiet popularity among the upper class. Sultan Ahmed III, encouraged by his confidant Grand Vizier Nefsehurli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, poured state funds into art, architecture, and publishing. Schools were opened, public libraries founded, and gardens extended even to provincial towns. It was a dream. But one built on a dangerously narrow ledge. To the average citizen, the tulip era looked like something designed for someone else. If you were a shoemaker, grocer, boatman, or street sweeper, your life had not improved. In fact, inflation had made it worse. Bread was more expensive. Taxes had increased. Janissaries returning from the borders found their pay delayed and their barracks neglected. Farmers displaced by garden-building programs wandered the city, looking for work they would not find. Meanwhile, in the palace, nobles hosted tulip banquets with 50 dishes, many of them sculpted into flower shapes. Women of the harem were gifted rare perfumes and tulip-embroidered slippers. The royal gardens were guarded not for safety, but to prevent bulb theft. As night fell, and the oil lanterns flickered through the city's elite quarters, the glow they cast made the darkness elsewhere seem even deeper. This was no longer just beauty. To many, it looked like betrayal. Surprisingly, the first resistance came not with swords, but with poetry. Disillusioned scholars and merchants began composing satirical verses. They slipped them into books, walls of mosques, even on the undersides of ceramic bowls in teahouses. One popular quatrain, attributed to a disgraced court clerk, went: "They drink their sherbet from tulip cups, while our bowls echo dry. They dance beneath the lantern silk, and let the children cry." Even some imams began to preach subtle sermons about excess and vanity, warning that tulips would soon become thorns. By 1728, complaints had begun reaching the Sultan's ears. But Ahmed III was unmoved. In his view, the empire needed a culture of peace, and the arts were its shield. He saw the growing gardens, the bookshops, and the libraries as signs of Ottoman endurance. Beauty, he believed, was a national resource. But belief alone cannot feed a population. Then came a butcher. Or rather, a former one, Patrona Halil, a man of Albanian origin, recently dismissed from the Janissaries. Charismatic, brutal, and quietly furious, Halil spent months listening to complaints in Istanbul's poorer neighborhoods. He heard their anger about the price of food, about unpaid wages, about gardens in the face of poverty. And he began organizing. By early 1730, small gatherings of craftsmen, disaffected soldiers, and apprentices were occurring in the city's coffeehouses and bathhouses. They whispered names, Halil's among them, and swapped news about court expenditures with rising fury. On the surface, everything still seemed calm. But in the shadows, revolution was already blooming. It came swiftly. In September of 1730, Halil and a small band of rebels marched through the city, chanting against the Grand Vizier and the Sultan. To their surprise, the crowds did not resist them, they joined. Within hours, the number of protesters grew from dozens to thousands. They were not just warriors or thugs. They were bakers, fishermen, students, and janissaries, those who had watched the tulip era from outside the garden gates. They stormed the vizier's palace, tore down the lanterns, burned the tulip beds, and demanded blood for beauty. The rebellion had begun. The tulip, so delicate and symbolic, was now the emblem of excess and the object of rage. And within the palace walls, Sultan Ahmed III, once the flower-loving patron of peace, faced a choice no garden could protect him from. You are standing in the imperial gardens once again. But this time, the air is no longer perfumed with hyacinths and rose water. The tulips have been trampled. The fountains are dry. And silence lingers where once music and laughter floated gently through the warm night. It is autumn of 1730. Sultan Ahmed III, once the patron of poets, flowers, and peace, sits in the inner courtyard of Topkapi Palace. The sounds of rebellion echo beyond the high walls. For the first time in decades, the voice of the people has grown louder than the songs of the court. The tulip era has come to its end. But not with grace. As the fires of the Patrona Halil rebellion raged through Istanbul, the palace scrambled to react. Ahmed III, typically reserved and scholarly, delayed. He had hoped the rebellion would fizzle, that the love of order and tradition would overpower the discontent. But by the second day, it became clear, his people no longer saw his rule as benevolent. On the advice of his remaining ministers, and to save his own life, Ahmed agreed to the rebels' first demand. He executed Grand Vizier Nefsahurli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, the man most associated with the extravagance of the tulip era. He was Ahmed's closest ally, the architect of the cultural renaissance, and perhaps the most tragic casualty of the revolt. It did not stop the violence, the gardens of the court were raided. Palaces torched. Lanterns smashed to the cobblestones. Books looted. Paintings burned. Tulip bulbs, the most prized objects of the past decade, were stomped into the mud by angry boots. Then, on the third day, the people demanded more. They wanted the Sultan himself. And in a move that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier, Ahmed III abdicated the throne. He handed power to his nephew, Mahmud I, and retreated into quiet exile in the palace grounds. No trial. No execution. Just silence. The age of gardens was over. The leader of the rebellion, Patrona Halil, ruled Istanbul for just 6 weeks after the uprising. His power was unofficial, no crown, no palace, but he controlled the city through sheer presence and fear. He dictated who was appointed in court, walked the halls of government as if he belonged there, and sent orders as if he wore the Sultan's ring. But Halil had no plan beyond destruction. He was a symbol, not a statesman. A spark, not a fire. Soon, those who once supported him began to fear his erratic behavior. His demands grew stranger. He insisted on opening bathhouses, dictated clothing styles, and spoke of himself in divine terms. By November of 1730, barely 2 months after the uprising, Halil was captured and executed by the new Sultan Mahmud I's supporters. The rebellion, though dramatic, had no enduring leader. It faded just as quickly as it had flared. But its impact would linger. The aftermath of the Tulip Rebellion ushered in a new era of conservatism and caution. Where Ahmed III had opened the gates to Europe, Mahmud I began to close them again. Reforms were slowed. Art was pushed into the background. Printing presses were tolerated but monitored. The Ottoman court withdrew into itself, wary of extravagance. Flowers were no longer political. Gardens were no longer theaters of empire. The language of refinement was replaced by a rhetoric of military strength and religious rectitude. Publicly, the empire pretended the tulip era had been a mistake. Privately, many still mourned its beauty. And some even tried to preserve it, secretly planting tulip bulbs in the backs of mosques and hidden courtyards, hoping that perhaps, in quieter times, the flowers might bloom again without drawing ire. The tragedy of the tulip era was not that it failed, but how misunderstood it was. Sultan Ahmed III truly believed that peace, beauty, and culture could stabilize a crumbling empire. He thought that by encouraging poetry instead of war, the people would find pride in elegance, not conquest. That art could be a form of survival. But in reality, the average subject of the empire was starving. Peace without bread is not peace. Art without equity is decoration. Gardens built upon debt are doomed to be uprooted. The Ottoman Empire would recover in some ways, but never again would it dare to dream so openly in tulips. You step away from the garden now. Not because it is gone, but because it has become memory. What happened in those 2 decades was neither glorious nor wasteful, it was human. A story of hope, misjudgment, beauty, pride, fragility, and power. It was an empire trying to remember itself not as a sword, but as a song. The tulip era was a whisper between battles. A pause in history. A soft page in a violent book. Even now, hundreds of years later, its lessons remain relevant. That prosperity must be shared to last. That beauty must be grounded to survive. That even the most delicate flower can start a fire. So the next time you see a tulip, perhaps on a postcard, or swaying in a city park, remember it once held the weight of an empire. And was loved enough to cause a revolution. Nothing more stirred. The city held its breath, waiting for morning. And Yu Liang waited with it, still as the gate he guarded. Not afraid. Not confused. Just curious. What stories had this gate swallowed? And what, exactly, was it trying to return? At last, the sky began to shift. First, a soft bruising of dark gray on the horizon. Then the slow bleed of indigo into blue. Yuliang always marked the end of night not by color, but by sound. A single bird. Then a second. And finally, the 12th drumbeat from the tower. That sound was his sunrise. Not because it brought light, but because it meant release. The gates would soon be unbarred. The streets would stir again. And he could rest. But before any of that, he still had his closing duties. The first came precisely at the 12th beat. A knock on the outer gate panel. 3 taps, firm, practiced. The kind only an official would make. Yuliang opened the inner slit and saw the senior morning steward, dressed in pale blue robes, already holding a parchment scroll. He nodded to the gatekeeper. "Final log collection," the steward said through the slit. "Give me a moment." Yuliang unbarred the small side door, handed over the night log, and nodded respectfully. The steward offered no comment, only a quick bow and immediate departure. Just as it had been every morning for 9 years. Once the steward was gone, Yuliang turned to his ritual sweep, the final round before off-duty. He started with the inner courtyard. Nothing unusual. Then the north side alcove. Empty. Then the alley where the bowl had been. Still nothing. But he paused there, just for a moment. You see, the dust wasn't smooth anymore. Someone, or something, had walked through it. 2 distinct footprints. Barefoot. No sandals. No soldier's boots. Just toes and arches, clearly pressed into the grit. They walked in, paused, and walked back out. But no second pair. No child's prints. No drag marks. Just one visitor. One exit. He stood there, unmoving, for what felt like a full minute. Then, instead of fear, he felt an odd calm. Whatever it was, it had come. It had left. And he had survived the night. Back in the gate tower, Yuliang removed his satchel and pulled out the wooden tablet that marked his shift. It was simple, carved pine, lacquered in dark brown, with his name etched in vertical characters. Yuliang, Inner Gate 16. He placed it on the stone wall shelf inside the tower, an offering to routine. There were at least 60 such tablets there now, each from nights he'd stood watch. They were not required. He carved them himself. They were not for the city. They were for the gate. A reminder that someone had kept it safe. His replacement arrived just after first light. A younger man, nervous, stiff, polite. "Anything to report?" the man asked. Yuliang looked at him carefully. Then handed him the gate keys, and finally said, "Check the alley before sunrise. Always check the alley." The man nodded, confused but respectful. Yuliang didn't explain. Some lessons were best earned. As he descended the outer stairs and re-entered the waking city, something changed. The streets he'd known his whole life looked newer. Not brighter. Not cleaner. Just, strangely unfamiliar. He wondered if it was the lack of sleep. Or perhaps, the act of noticing. Too often, people moved through the city without ever looking at it. But after a long night of silence, the bricks, the carts, the painted shop signs, each felt like part of a larger, breathing organism. He passed a tea vendor lighting her stove. She bowed slightly. He passed a child tossing pebbles at a sleeping dog. He smiled. He passed an old scholar unfurling scrolls on a blanket. He paused there. The scholar looked up. Looking for something? Yu Yang shrugged. Just walking. Ah. Then may your steps not return too quickly, the man said cryptically. He smiled again, nodded, and moved on. By the time he reached his small apartment near the fishmonger's lane, the sun had lifted just above the rooflines. He climbed the stairs, entered the room, and began to remove his boots. Dust fell from them. A bit more than usual. He reached into the satchel to retrieve his spare tunic, and to his surprise, felt something round and cool at the bottom. He drew it out. The bowl. The same ceramic bowl from the alley. Uncracked. Unglazed. Just plain and smooth. He stared at it for a long moment. He did not remember picking it up. He did not remember opening his satchel. But there it was. He placed it on the shelf by the window, beside a small incense tray. Not out of fear. But respect. A silent gesture. A thank you, perhaps, to the gate, or whatever passed through it. Then, finally, he lay down. The bed was firm. The room warm. And as his body eased into rest, his last thought was not about drums, or ghosts, or gates. It was about stillness. The kind only a long night, a quiet wall, and a well-watched city could offer.